Welcome. Welcome to week 3 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. Just only announcement, paper 1 is due right now. The collection strategy is due right now, yesterday, tomorrow, depending on when you're watching this. So just be those advised, and I'll take about a week to get those back to you overall. So review of last week, of week 2. So requirements, again, we talked about them integrated into the collection plan. You saw the lectures on that. Hopefully you are taking note of that, of the collection plan, and taking note of that when you see the example in your paper this week. So then we shifted to intelligence traps. These are analytical traps that you'll talk more in depth when you talk about psychology of intelligence in a future course, but I just want to give you kind of a preview of the big ones that we see policymakers and law enforcement and intelligence analysts kind of falling into. Key ones, again, confirmation bias. This is what, again, you come to a conclusion or you come to an assessment and all future information is interpreted to confirm that original assessment. That is something that everyone needs to be cognizant of. Mirror imaging. This is where we assume, particularly a potential adversary country, would follow the same protocols and the same decision making that we would in the United States, or we would in this company. In fact, I bring the examples of Russia. Russia right now, demonstrations in Russia, which are going on right now as I speak, are interpreted far, far more different than demonstrations in the United States. For Putin, seeing people being in the street is a threat to him, threat to his actual existence. Leaders, particularly in totalitarian or authoritarian countries, whether they Putin, whether it's Kim Jong-un in North Korea, we assume they're unitary actors and they act in a rational model. Well, rationality for them is survival, right? The U.S. president doesn't have to worry about survival if he loses an election, for the most part anyway. But Russia, Vladimir Putin is thinking of Tsar Nicholas and his, how he died when he lost power. Kim Jong-un is thinking the same thing. He either stays in power or he dies a horrible death. That's their mentality, and it's hard for us to kind of understand it. And too many times we placate our mentality on what they're doing. And then this was all displayed in the Confessions. Great documentary. I hope you take those lessons to heart. I hope when you watched it, you were angry, or it built up a certain amount of anger towards the injustice that happened. And I just want to give you a heads up that documentary ended in 2010, or was filmed in 2010. In the years since, those four guys, that their records were expunged, so they were not only were they released as a shown documentary, but they were released off the sexual offender list. And only in 2019, only a year ago, right before the pandemic hit, did they get final settlements, and their lawsuits were finally awarded. So it was a 20-year injustice that went on for the Norfolk Four. So a couple of the analytical traps we saw. This is classic confirmation bias. Almost ridiculous amount of confirmation bias in this case study. They settled on one theory of the case, and then they really manipulated their theories to fit into that one model. That this was done by a bunch of soldiers that were or sailors that was done as far as some sort of love crime, and they always try, and if that theory didn't work or the DNA said otherwise, they would bring in more people to confirm that original assertion. You had vividness bias in this case. What sold this to the juries, to the courts, was the confession, and you heard the confessions and you heard what they said. The prosecutors and the detectives knew that a confession plays a lot more, it's a lot more vivid than DNA evidence or motivation or any of those more traditional law enforcement, prosecutorial, criminal investigative techniques. But the confession, they knew, Detective Ford knew, again, that playing those confessions would play well in the court, and it did. It played well in front of a jury, and that was because it was very vivid. Negative evidence. This is brought up in the issue, but we saw this in the Confessions documentary, where they focused on one person. They say, hey, let's try and connect this person to the crime. What they didn't ask is, if this person, or any of the 4 people that were convicted, if they committed the crime, why are we not seeing DNA evidence, motivation, other trace evidence, other issues that would have helped the case further? They didn't flip the question on the head, and we're going to see this over and over again. Whether it's Pearl Harbor, whether it's Iraq WMD, is that they don't, they focus on their target and they try and get the evidence back at the target. They don't ask the reverse question: if he is guilty, why are we not seeing X, Y, and Z? Clientelism. We'll talk about this in depth in Iraq WMD, but certainly the prosecutors and the detectives were under pressure to make this arrest and make this conviction. No one wanted to see a criminal element out there doing, out loose, committing crimes. So they were under enormous pressure from the public and from other officials to get this conviction, which contributed to the false conviction that you saw before. Finally, Georgetown values. I don't know how many people are here in this program, how many people are Catholic or Jesuit or, religion matters to people. Georgetown does try and instill a sense of Jesuit tradition, and you could call that just ethical tradition, humanistic tradition regarding your education here. And I think this is a case of an injustice. We're training you to be in positions like Detective Ford's position or other positions where you could recognize your biases, and you do so in a way that doesn't cause suffering. And again, these people suffered for 20 years for this injustice. And one thing to just take away is, again, Georgetown does have the value of justice, that you're in these leadership positions and you have to act wisely. And in this case, the system didn't work here. And before many of you, kind of focused on Detective Ford and said that it was him, I just want to remind you that it was not just Detective Ford. It was prosecutors, it was juries, it was judges, it was appellate judges, went all the way up to the governor's office, that all failed these 4 individuals for one reason or another. And then finally, I had in this debate about a year ago with a student, and it didn't, it resonated with me. I don't necessarily agree with what he said, but, we talked about analytical biases here, whether it's in law enforcement or intelligence. And he said, Detective Ford particularly, he did not suffer from bias. Good people suffer from bias. Evil people like Detective Ford just have malevolent intent, that they're just bad people. And as you'll see in future iterations, good people will have biases, and good people failed on these biases, and I would agree with that. I'm not so necessarily. I would say that Detective Ford is just a kind of a bad apple or an evil person, and maybe this tells me about my craven view of human nature. But I think we could all be Detective Fords in one form or another. I think we have the ability to cause immense suffering, regardless of we might look at that in retrospect, think that's a bad thing. But I think in certain positions, we can inflict a lot of suffering on our fellow human beings. So that kind of wraps up the confession. Just going into week 3, a lot of reading. Again, we're up to 2 discussions per week. 2 case studies are on strategic surprise, or Pearl Harbor, and the Yom Kippur War. And the question is, what were the failures? And as you're reading, Go through the collection or the intelligence cycle. Where were the failures in the intelligence cycle? Was it due to collection? Was it due to analysis? Was it due to the policy interface? Policymakers failing to act? Or were there underlying circumstances, just bad luck, bad issues happen that caused the failures for the Pearl Harbor and the Yom Kippur War? And just go through those as you're reading those. Just make sure that you kind of pinpoint where you think things went wrong. And the readings, you have the Dahl, the Intelligence and Surprise Attack book, excellent synopsis of Pearl Harbor and what went wrong with Pearl Harbor. You have the actually, it's not the Avi Shalom anymore. I need to put the Bruce Riddell article, which I replaced the Avi Shalom because it was a little bit outdated. So it's the Bruce Riddell article on the Yom Kippur War, and then the Al Jazeera documentary on the crossing. It's actually a 3-part documentary. Just watch the first hour, and even among the first hour, the first half hour will give you the intelligence failure surrounding the Yom Kippur War. So I look forward to this week's discussion. If there's any issues or anything, please let me know. And if there's questions, I'll be doing your collection. I'll be grading your collection papers. So if there's questions or issues, please let me know.